This is Fiery Cross Island. It's a little more than 1 square mile in size, and it's home to a Chinese military base. There's a 10,000-foot airstrip, an advanced radar station, a missile defense system, and about 200 troops. But the strangest thing about Fiery Cross Island is that 2 years ago, it didn't exist. And neither did the 6 other Chinese military bases that have been built on man-made islands in the South China Sea. If you look at this satellite image from 2014, you can see huge Chinese ships collecting around remote reefs in the Spratly Islands, an archipelago in the South China Sea. In this image, these ships are rapidly pumping sand and rock up onto the reef. They're building islands. And less than a year later, the Chinese had seaports, air bases, and buildings on their new island, and the world had taken notice.
We continue our look this morning at what China does not want you to see. The superpower is reclaiming land
in 7 spots in the South China Sea,
adding on average more than 3.5 acres every day.
See, with these islands, China's trying to lay claim to one of the most important areas of ocean in the world, the South China Sea. The South China Sea is incredibly rich in natural resources. 11 billion barrels of oil, 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, and 10% of the world's fisheries. Most importantly though, 30% of the world's shipping trade flows through here, to the booming population centers and economic markets of Southeast Asia. It's an extremely important body of water, and right now 5 countries lay claim to some part of it. Now, most countries base their claim off the UN Law of the Seas, which says a country's territorial waters extend 200 miles off their shore, an area called the Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ. Countries have exclusive rights to all the resources and trade in their EEZ. It's their sovereign territory. So for example, any oil that's found within 200 miles off the coast of Vietnam belongs exclusively to Vietnam. But any area that isn't in an EEZ is regarded as international waters, and it falls under UN maritime law, which means everybody shares it. Now, every country in the South China Sea region uses this 200-mile EEZ threshold to determine its claims. All except China. China argues they have a historical claim to the South China Sea, dating back to naval expeditions in the 15th century. And they mark it using a really confusing border called the 9-dash line. Following World War II, Japan, who had dominated the entire region, lost all control of its surrounding seas. China used the moment to claim the South China Sea by drawing this imprecise line on the map that encompassed 90% of the South China Sea. It became known as the 9-dash line. And when the UN established the 200-mile EEZ in 1973, China stuck to its own line, refusing to clarify its boundaries and ignoring claims by other countries. Now that brings us to the Spratly Islands. It's a remote, barely inhabited cluster of islands currently claimed by China, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia. The Spratlys are both geographically and symbolically at the heart of the South China Sea. That's because any country that can claim the Spratly Islands can extend their EEZs to include them, and gain exclusive rights to the surrounding territory. But it's really hard to legitimately claim uninhabited piles of sand, so a few nations have built small buildings and ports on their claimed islands, and even stuck a few people there. But China believes all of the Spratly Islands belong to them, which brings us back to why they're building islands there. Installing military bases on these new artificial islands took the dispute to a whole new level, showing how China is potentially willing to defend its claims with force. Now, this is about when the United States took notice. While the US has no claim in the South China Sea, it is the world's lone superpower and uses its massive navy to defend international waters. But China sees the US presence in the area as an encroachment in their backyard. When a US destroyer ship sailed just 12 miles off the shore of one of China's man-made islands in the Spratlys, China sent out their own destroyer and a patrol boat as a warning. China's building these islands in order to increase control around the surrounding waters, using a strategy that they've deemed the cabbage strategy, where they surround a contested island with as many ships as possible. In May of 2013, China sent several ships to Ayungin Shoal, which is just 105 nautical miles off the coast of the Philippines, well within that 200-mile EEZ. The Philippines has 8 soldiers stationed there. Like wrapping leaves around a cabbage, the Chinese sealed off the Philippines' access to Ayungin Shoal with fishing boats, surveillance ships, and Navy destroyers, creating a blockade so that the Filipinos can't receive shipments of food and supplies. By building their own man-made islands, China is essentially building naval bases. The more islands they have, the more ships they can support, and the more territory they can slowly take control of. And the Chinese cautiously use the cabbage strategy in the Spratly Islands, taking over contested territory, but in small steps, avoiding the possibility of igniting a bigger conflict. But the disputes are intensifying. Countries are now actively arresting trespassers in waters that they claim. And China could go a step further. Since 2015, they've threatened to declare an air identification zone above the South China Sea, declaring that all aircraft that fly through it would need Chinese permission. Now, publicly, China insists that their intentions are not militaristic, but their actions say otherwise, and it's heightening tensions in the region. Steve Bannon, who sits on the U.S. National Security Council and who is one of President Trump's closest advisors, is almost certain that the U.S. will go to war in the South China Sea.
We're going to war in the South China Sea. I was a sailor there, a naval officer. We're going to war in the South China Sea in 5 to 10 years, aren't we? There's no doubt about it.
But for now, the disputes remain only in the legal and diplomatic realms that only occasionally break into minor clashes. In July 2016, the International Court at The Hague ruled in favor of the Philippines, who charged China with invading their rightful territory in the South China Sea. But China dismissed the ruling, and enforcement of the law doesn't seem likely, even from the US, who released a vague statement urging the two countries to clarify their claims and work together to resolve their disputes, which is another way of saying we don't really want to deal with this. In fact, as the conflict escalates and international courts get involved, the US is stuck in a tricky position. On one hand, they do not want to risk provoking a conflict with China, but on the other, they want China to stop bullying their allies in the region. Up until now, the US has managed the situation by continuing to patrol through the South China Sea. It's also likely that the US would fly fighter jets above the sea if China actually does declare an air identification zone. These are symbolic but effective ways of keeping China in check, while not getting too involved in the details of the conflict. So far, the disputes in the South China Sea have not become violent, but countries are starting to defend their claims by increasing troop numbers, weaponizing their territory, and provoking each other. It's a complex situation that will continue to gain international attention, for better or for worse.
These are satellite images from the deserts of western China. Look closely and you'll see these huge complexes being built. From the sky, they sort of look like factories or even schools. But look even closer. This line is one facility's perimeter wall. And these shadows, they're cast by watchtowers along the wall. This compound isn't a school or a factory. It's an internment camp. Inside these camps, the Chinese government is detaining as many as 1 million Uyghurs, China's mostly Muslim minority. China doesn't want the world to know any of this. But the story of these camps is also the story of how we know about them, and China's efforts to cover them up.
As soon as we began to document the re-education centers, there was Chinese government officials deleting what we were finding.
Uyghurs mainly live here, in the Xinjiang province of northwestern China. That puts them closer to the capitals of Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan than to Beijing. And Uyghurs are also closer culturally to those Turkic groups than they are to the Han Chinese, China's ethnic majority.
The Uyghurs speak a Turkic language. Their culture is different. They have particular styles of music, a whole rich history that is unique to them.
This is Sigal Samuel, a reporter at Vox.
I've been reporting on the Uyghur crisis in China for about a year now. China has been concerned for decades about the possibility of Uyghur separatism.
Uyghurs have actually had their own independent nation 2 separate times in the last century. In 1933, they established the Islamic Republic of East Turkestan, here in Kashgar. But it crumbled less than a year later when it was taken over by Chinese forces. Then, in 1944, the Soviet Union backed the creation of the East Turkestan Republic, based here. But when China became communist in 1949, the Soviet Union turned on East Turkestan and helped China take it over again. Part of why the Xinjiang region is so important to China is that it's rich with energy resources. And as China's economy grew, so did its need for energy. Today, Xinjiang accounts for nearly 40% of China's coal reserves. and over 20% of the country's oil and gas. It also accounts for 20% of China's potential for wind energy.
China needs resources, it needs energy, it needs the geographical location, the area on which Xinjiang sits. That's where Uyghurs are, that's where they're living. And so China really wants to have a solid sense of control over that area.
As far back as the 1950s, China saw an opportunity to dilute the influence of the potentially rebellious Uyghurs and started encouraging the migration of Han Chinese into Xinjiang. And it worked. In 1945, Uyghurs made up over 80% of the population, compared to just 6% Han Chinese. By 2008, Xinjiang was 46% Uyghur compared to 39% Han Chinese. But over the years, as Xinjiang developed economically, Uyghurs were left behind, working mostly low-wage jobs in agriculture, while the Han held higher-paying jobs. Finally, in 2009, a Uyghur protest against discrimination at the hands of the Han and the Chinese government erupted in violence.
Bloody riots broke out, pitting ethnic Uyghur Muslims against the dominant Han Chinese.
One of the worst riots took place in the provincial capital of Urumqi. About 200 people were killed and hundreds injured during the unrest.
That was sort of an inflection point. After that, the Chinese really started to crack down harder on the Uyghurs.
And by 2013, Xinjiang had become even more important to China. The country launched the Belt and Road Initiative, a $1 trillion investment in things like fiber optic cables, train lines, and gas pipelines, meant to boost the country's economic and political influence around the world by making it easier to trade with China. If you plot these projects on a map, you'll see a lot of them pass through Xinjiang, making the province arguably the most important corridor for the whole project. China would need to ensure that Xinjiang remained securely in its hands.
The Uyghurs came to be perceived and painted more as a threat, as a separatist threat, as an extremist threat.
In 2016 and 2017, the country enacted a series of de-extremification policies aimed at Muslims, like banning long beards. And Xinjiang was effectively turned into a high-tech police state.
So this kind of thing is happening all over the country, but in Xinjiang, it's been just increased by orders of magnitude. We're talking about Uyghurs having to hand over their phones at checkpoints. We're even talking about QR codes being installed on the outside of their homes.
But the most brutal part of this crackdown was hidden to the world at first.
In this image, you see the opening of this facility. The signage, it says De-Extremification Re-Education Center.
Around 2017, China started building these internment camps, these large-scale places to detain Uyghurs. China says that these camps are necessary because the Uyghurs are a terrorist threat, a separatist threat, people who are infected with extremist thinking.
But it wasn't until Uyghurs who had been detained told their stories that the picture from inside the camps came into clearer focus.
They're forced to memorize and recite Communist Party propaganda every day. They're often forced to criticize their own Islamic beliefs and to criticize the beliefs of their fellow detainees.
We had to sing songs hailing the Communist Party. We had to repeat in Chinese, "Long live Xi Jinping."
There have been reports of death, of torture.
3 guards surrounded me and abused me.
Each time I was electrocuted, my whole body would shake.
So there's this atmosphere of just trying to uproot what you believe in.
At first, China denied the existence of these camps.
他们安居乐业，享受着宪法所规定的宗教信仰自由，所以呢，根本不存在你刚才提到的一些报道当中说的所谓的新疆维族人的问题。
But activists and academics fought back.
A lot of people around the world are scouring the internet for evidence of China's internment camps for Uyghurs.
In terms of the strategies and tools that I've used, I know others have used to uncover evidence of these camps, it's quite simply a computer and knowledge of Chinese and thinking about what words, especially government websites, would use.
People have unearthed government documents.
And then we had growing visual evidence. We're looking at satellite images. We can actually trace the creation and expansion of the re-education camp. It was a matter of I think luck or chance. I uncovered this image, and until then we didn't have that piece of visual evidence that said this is what it is, and this is what the Chinese government is calling it.
Tim isn't alone. There's a whole network of web sleuths around the world using basic internet tools to document what China doesn't want the world to see. And they've gotten China to change their story, at least a little.
China was denying that these re-education centers exist until journalists and academics and others started to really amass a body of evidence that was so convincing that China couldn't just deny it anymore.
China took a different approach and started admitting that these facilities exist, but carefully painted them as training schools for potential criminals or terrorists.
实际上，我们这个中心啊，是一所这个寄宿制的学校。
In the meantime, the camps are still there and growing. This camp, one of China's largest, was as big as the nearby city of Dabancheng in 2017. But by 2018, the camp had expanded to twice the size.
From China's perspective, they think it's worth it. They want to make sure Xinjiang is an area of the country that they have total control over. And if that comes with a high human cost and even a reputational blow on the international stage, China so far seems willing to do that anyway.